Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. This week, in honor of an upcoming foodie holiday, we're talking about a commander who always loves seconds. Yarok the Desecrated, doubler of Enter the Battlefield triggers, Panharmonicon on a stick, and winner of the wait, it also has Death Touch award. Yarok, the second most popular Sultai commander and 32nd most popular commander overall, Yarok's EDHREC page reveals an enormous list of some of the format's quintessential green, blue, and black value pieces. Any one of these Enter the Battlefield triggers is good on its own, but getting them all twice can bury opponents under mountains of value. Let's do it to it. We'll grab Yarok's average deck from the average deck list feature and import it to the Archidect deck building website. As always in this series, any swaps made to the average deck list must either keep the total price of the list cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the deck. Yarok is a very diverse commander. You can focus entirely on creatures with Enter the Battlefield abilities, or entirely on landfall effects, since Yarok's ability does indeed count lands, or some folks make Yarok a straight-up combo deck, while others build the entire deck around casting just the spell Villainous Wealth as many times as possible. For some commanders, getting an average deck list doesn't paint a great picture of what they can do. For example, Atraxa is famous for being a Super Friends commander and an Infect commander and a commander for +1 counters, and each of those is a disparate strategy. But if you were to take an average deck list, you might get a messy conglomeration, a deck list that is like 1/3 Super Friends, 1/3 Infect, and 1/3 +1 counters. Each of those strategies doesn't actually have a lot of overlap, so that average wouldn't necessarily do any of those individual strategies justice. This is why we always recommend the advanced filters on EDHREC to tailor the recommendations that you get to your specific needs. I had worried that this disparate strategy issue would also be the case with Yarok because of how diverse this commander can be, but after getting to know the deck a bit more, it looks like Yarok actually does a really great job of mixing its focus on tons of Enter the Battlefield effects with a healthy number of landfall payoffs. There certainly will be decks out there that lean much more strongly in one direction than the other, but as averages go, I'm actually really impressed with how well this list threads that needle. Looking over Yarok's core cards, any one of these creatures is perfectly fine to cast on its own, even without Yarok in play. While some commanders will take obscure cards that aren't usually fantastic and then turn them into powerhouses by using unusual synergies, Yarok instead takes already good cards and just makes them better. It's for this reason that Yarok is the commander I've most commonly seen get accused of being just a, quote, good stuff deck. Now, I don't think that's a particularly useful criticism. People should just play what they like. What I think it can teach us, though, is a good lesson for us to understand about how this deck functions and how important the commander is to its success. Yarok decks can totally win a game without ever needing to cast the commander. Yarok is not a linchpin to the entire deck strategy. Without it in play, the deck still flourishes. When it is in play, it just kicks things into high gear. We can contrast this against many other popular strategies out there, such as elves or zombies or enchantress decks whose synergies compound more exponentially than Yarok's, for instance because tons of those creatures buff each other up, or tons of enchantments become draw engines or protect each other, but Yarok relies upon individually powerful haymakers, which means that those individual cards can probably be dealt with a little bit more easily, but Yarok also gets off the ground very quickly, whereas other decks may need more momentum to get going, but once they're set up, they can't be dismantled by only removing a single brick from the wall. I have to say though, my personal favorite synergy in the deck is when you have a Yarok in play with a Zendikar's Royal and a Arisen Reef. Woo boy, that's a lot of elemental tokens making lands, and a lot of lands making elemental tokens. This deck contains tons of amazing synergies, but it's important for us to recognize that it mostly functions with a bunch of individual powerhouses and that the deck can also get away with being a little bit agnostic about the importance of its commander. So, with that philosophy established, how do we go about improving Yarok's abode? Well, we'll have two sections to this video. First, some adjustments to the list in its current state, and second, a much more budget-friendly version of the list. Let's get going. Unsurprisingly, this starting average deck list is in a really good state already. We'll only have a few minor tweaks to make in part 1. Alright, I'm gonna try to move quick. First thing, Arcane Signet. This card's grand, there's nothing wrong with it. Since we have so many landfall payoffs though, I think I'd prefer a ramp that takes the form of finding lands to put into play. So I'd like to switch this out for a simple Sakura Tribe Elder. Yes, the Signet is good when we don't have any green mana, but on balance, I think the potential Sakura landfall payoffs would be bigger than the occasional game where the Signet might be the only thing that would get us access to our highest density color. After that, I'm gonna interrogate some of the removal effects in this deck. Shriekmaw, I have a history with you, buddy. I played this one in Marin of Clan Neltoth for years, but I eventually took it out of even that deck because the non-artifact and non-black restriction here is really rough. There are a lot of good multicolored creatures out there, especially powerhouse commanders, that this card just can't hit. If I might get a little cheeky, I'd therefore propose swapping this out for a Kenrith's Transformation. It neutralizes a creature by turning it into an elk, and it replaces itself by drawing a card. Or, with Yarok in play, drawing us 2 cards. Removal that replaces itself and then some? That's freaking delightful. After that, I took a look at the land count and couldn't help but fret a little bit. This land count is low, especially when a deck cares about having landfall payoffs, but at the same time, this isn't an exclusively landfall deck either. And we have a lot of ramp sources going on here. I think I could do with just at least one more land, so how about we add a Path of Ancestry? I mean, this one's just great. It gets us our 3 colors, and it can do a little bit of scrying along the way. And I have one more land-related card to add, but in order to add, we must cut, so this is where we break some hearts. I'll try to tackle both of these cuts at the same time. I have a hard time with Muldrotha and with Nissa. Nissa gets double the loyalty from her triggered ability, and that's rad. I just also didn't find myself caring all that much about her effects. This deck just didn't struggle with getting big awesome stuff into play to do powerful things, so Nissa honestly felt like a middleman more than an asset. And as for Muldrotha, I know how amazing she is. I just think she doesn't get to flourish here. She mostly gets to play a land from the grave sometimes, and occasionally can get back a creature, but if we like land recursion, we already have a lot of that, and if we like creature revival, this isn't the most efficient way to do it. And let's examine the curve here. Like, we can get a lot of bang for our buck for 6 mana. If it was within budget, I would suggest replacing this straight up with AC Tyrant of Gyre Straits, especially since the deck already has a Tatiova. Like, that's the forward momentum that this deck possesses. That's the kind of stuff we could do for 6 mana. It's just also not in budget, and I just didn't find that Muldrotha really fit the bill here. Or rather, I found that she encourages a different type of value engine than the one that Yarok is best suited for. Anyway, those are my cuts, and that leaves us room for just one more addition to the deck, and it's an old favorite. Stone, Cedar, Hierophant. This thing is flipping brilliant, especially when you're untapping 2 lands per land drop. This card's incredible. I know I've added this card to a ton of decks in the Upping the Average series, but you know what? I will only stop talking about how good it is when it finally gets its due. Play this one, I promise. It's so good. That'll be it for my swaps, but before moving to the budget section, here are some higher cost honorable mentions. I already talked about AC before, but I'll also recommend Fairy Artisans and the card Necromancy along with it. Fairy Artisans will trigger twice for each enemy creature that hits the field, and each of those tokens, if they have entered the battlefield effects, will also get their abilities twice. That's public enemy number 1 levels of value. Fairy Artisans is bonkers in general, but especially here. And as for Necromancy, take special note of how this card works. That's an enter the battlefield ability. Necromancy hits the field, triggers, revives a creature, and becomes an aura that attaches to that creature. And Yarok will make that effect happen twice, so you'd get back 2 creatures. And yes, Necromancy is able to attach to both of them and keep them both in play. Now that is how you do reanimation in this deck, my friends. Okie doke, here is the first version of the list with the cuts in the maybe board and the link in the description below. But Yarok is not satisfied with just one discussion. We've got to double things up with part 2. Let's get this deck more budget friendly. The average deck list started off with a decent number of expensive cards that are exciting to double up with Yarok's ability. But the thing is, when you're doubling things up, you don't need the expensive cards for the doubling of stuff to be really exciting. This deck's got some awesome cards in it, but if you don't have access to some of these, no worries, we'll be fine without them. We're tossing approximately a dozen cards that cost above the $9 to $10-ish mark. We'll also pick at the mana base too, which contains some amazing fetch lands and other gems, but which also inflates the price of the deck by quite a lot. And voila, we have a brand new foundation to work off of. Well, okay, to be honest, I can't really say it's brand new, The huge core aspects of the deck are still intact. The strategy is still very identifiable here. A lot of the most expensive cards that we lost were actually a little bit more tangential or support system-y, like extra card draw effects to make the deck more efficient. But those big expensive cards that we no longer have were hardly the core linchpins of the strategy, you know? This is what I mean when I say that we're gonna be fine without those expensive cards. This commander is still gonna get out there and mess things up for our enemies. So, let's get to business. What is it that we're adding in? Well, I have to start with the lands, even though they're not the spiciest. Some budget duels will replace the lands we lost that had specific land types, because we have a few spells that care about that sort of thing. And for efficiency, I think I'll also add in the pain lands. I don't want to disrupt our tempo too much. We could use some good old-fashioned color fixing that helps keep on curve in our land fixing suite. And in addition to that, I also think the temples are a very good fit here. Like, these are already some of my go-to budget duels just in general, but getting to scry 1-2 times if Yarok's in play, that's just the cherry on top. Oh, and you may notice that I'm adding in a few more lands than the original deck contained. When we're on a budget and we've lost some of the biggest card draw engines, I want us to make sure that we've got our early land drops in order and that we don't get mana screwed. We should be sensible with how we approach our mana base when we're not playing a bunch of those big $50 super efficient spells. That's all I'm saying. Alright, now we're gonna go a little funky. We lost some fetch lands in the budget culling, but we still have a few budget fetchers, like these guys. And I think that they want some friends. After all, we need to keep those Avenger of Zendikar triggers happy, you know? So I'd like to include 3 of the new Capenna fetches. These automatically crack to find a basic and gain 1 life, which is cute. They have some color restrictions, which we do have to take note of, and that's why I'm making sure to include 1 of each that can grab us an island or swamp, a swamp or forest, and a forest or island. As budget color fixing goes, this is great for us. All those landfall cards in the deck want lands that can potentially count for 2 land drops. Now, it's important to note that Yarok does not actually double these effects. Each of these lands is worded very carefully. When they enter, yes, they have a trigger, and that trigger will technically be doubled by Yarok, but the land itself has to be sacrificed for us to find a basic land card off the ability. So that second triggered ability doesn't do anything, because the fetch land will already have gone away. Just a quick rules note, don't get confused on it, but these are still pretty good for our landfall payoffs. And finally, for a quick utility land in the mix, let's also snag us a demolition field. Land removal that can also double up to get us an extra land drop to trigger at instant speed for our landfall effects. Again, that's just pretty clutch. Like, we'd play this effect even if it didn't have that extra bonus, so the fact that we could potentially do extra tricks with it, that's just gravy. Okay, now to the non-land cards. I mentioned Fairy Artisans before, and Aboleth's Spawn is a pretty good imitation of that one. This hasn't struck gold in the format in the same way that the Artisans did, but this is perfect for Yarok. And if this card isn't all that popular for a bunch of other decks, that's alright. That just means that we get to play it for cheap. Oh, and remember how I was conflicted about the card Shriekmaw? Well, I'm not conflicted about Foundation Breaker. I love this thing. I just love this. This might be one of my favorite cards from the Modern Horizons 2 set. This card is great for 2 mana and for 4 mana. Double the destruction, don't mind if I do. After that, I want to make sure we have good, effective recursion, since we no longer have stuff like the Ancient Green Warden in this deck. We obviously can't afford to get a Crucible of Worlds, but Ramanop Excavator is much cheaper to acquire, and it's an easy card to cast. In fact, speaking of recursion, this deck already contains Eternal Witness, right? So how about we also pop a Timeless Witness in here to go alongside it? These are especially powerful with the Ghostly Flicker and Displace spells that are already in the deck too, since they can flicker the Witness and a friend, and in addition to getting all that awesome value, we can instantly get those spells right back. Ramanop loves to be here, and Timeless Witness can't help but say, "Witness me." Up next, I think we need to also address our deck's firepower now that we're on a budget. We have some excellent things in the deck already, of course. These are great win conditions, but it's good to diversify our threats beyond just combative win cons, you know? Retreat to Hagra is one of my favorite landfall cards ever for exactly this reason, and I think the over-the-top nature of life loss effects would suit us very well here. So I'm just gonna be blunt. Grey Merchant is bonkers. I know, this surprises no one. And Ob Nixilis is fantastic. Play 1 land and he swells to a 9/9 and clocks someone for 6 right off the bat. Gross. Yarok is in love. And finally, the biggest thing we lost in the budget culling were the card advantage effects. Obviously, nothing is going to replace the potency of those big, bright, huge, expensive spells, but we've got a few slots here that we can use to help make sure that the wheels stay greased. So, I could go with the classic, like Visionary or Wall of Blossoms or Fibblethip, and those are perfectly good. They're cheap, they grease the wheels, they interact splendidly with flicker effects in the deck. Those are all extremely important factors. But I want to try to have a little extra fun with this idea, if that's okay with you. So instead of the classics, I'm actually going to start us off with a generous patron. Enters the battlefield, supports 2, and we can put those counters onto our stuff or onto opponent's stuff. Whenever we put one or more counters onto an opponent's creature, we'll draw a card. So yes, we are giving +1 counters away, but if we put a counter onto each of 2 different creatures, then we'll draw 2 cards for 3 mana. Or if Yarok's in play, we could do that twice and draw 4 cards for 3 mana. Like sure, we powered up an opponent's thing, but our commander has Death Touch, what do we care? The only thing that's actually a problem for us is if our opponents don't have any creatures in play at all, but that's a pretty rare occurrence. I like the potential here, and I like the silliness. The next one is just straight up Karuga. Like not as a companion, just in the 99 as a dang good draw spell that we can flicker, that we can Panharmonicon, that we can Conjurer's Closet to our heart's content, whether Yarok is in play or not. I don't know what else to say here, it's just a good card. And finally, this one almost passed me by. Sicarian Infiltrator, the Squad-tastic draw spell. It's a simple cantrip all on its own, but if we have enough extra mana, we could also pay an extra 2 when we cast it to get a copy. And when those enter, we would draw a total of 2 cards. Unless, of course, Yarok is in play, which completely changes the math. That becomes 3 mana with Flash to draw 2 cards, or 5 mana with Flash to draw 4, or 7 mana to draw 6. Like, you get the picture. This is scalable, adjustable draw that can also still be played early and get blinked by our silly spells. That's just great flexibility, and that's exactly the type of card advantage we need. Woof, that should do it. I hope Yarok's happy with this second helping. You can find a link to both versions of the deck in the description box below, with the cuts in the maybe board. Well, that's the video, but you know, in honor of Yarok, I think it'd be really cool if we all decided to watch it a second time. If you have any other recommendations that you would make for your fellow Yarok players, make sure you leave those suggestions down in the comments below. And thanks so much for watching.